So to begin with, we'll take a moment to set our motivation. It's very important to do this. Our intentions really have great significance. So we could just set our motivation to have a good time, but we want to do something more meaningful and more long-lasting. And so in the Buddhist perspective, we're going to have many lifetimes, and we want to have excellent opportunities, and we want to eventually reach a place where we have a real peaceful and permanent kind of happiness. And as Mahayana Buddhists, we want to help others to do the same. So let's try to expand our mind a little bit, just at the beginning here, to really take a long-term view towards what we're doing, even this morning, just for the next hour. So we're going to include all beings in our hearts, and we're going to have a recognition of our own potential, that we have many good qualities at this moment, and we can develop them to perfection. And we also have hindrances in ourselves, and we can diminish those and eventually get rid of them completely. So let's hold this with this intention and this motivation to be of benefit, to help to create peace in this chaotic world. Okay, well, that's our motivation. So this verse, I'm going to read the verse first, and then I'm going to just try to explain the different parts of it. Because when I read the verse, I would bet most people in here don't know what the heck they're talking about. Just the words themselves, like, what is that? So this verse says, since the 5 perfections without wisdom cannot bring perfect enlightenment, along with skillful means, cultivate the wisdom which does not conceive the 3 spheres as real. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. Everybody understand it? Okay, let's go. We're done. Okay. So let's start with the book. Don't believe everything you think. I said that to my sister this morning. I was telling her on the phone, because yesterday was my birthday, so she called, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to give a little talk this morning. And the book's called Don't Believe Everything You Think. And right away, she had an idea of like, yeah, I shouldn't believe all these stories I'm telling myself. What do you think? There's so many things, the notion is kind of strange at first. I mean, it is, but really think about it. We can come up with so many examples. Everyone in this room can come up with probably 100 examples of their own experience. Like, okay, we all know the story of everybody's blind and they're touching the elephant. One's got the ears, and one's got the trunk, and one's got the tail, and one's got the leg. And one thinks they're holding on to a hose, and one thinks they're holding on to a fire hose, and one thinks they're the ear, I don't know what that is, a fan. They have a different thought about what that thing is. And are any of them right? Well, they don't all have the big picture. Okay, how about if you were to look way down the valley here and you saw some spots down there? You might think, oh, I wonder what those are. They look like mounds of dirt. And you think, oh, they're mounds of dirt. But actually, if you took out some binoculars and you look down there, you'd actually see they're cows. And then you'd think, oh, they're cows. So now you think something different, right? Or yesterday you had a really good idea about maybe you're writing a poem, and you had a really good idea about how you were going to do this verse. It was a great idea. And then you read it today, oh man, what a crappy idea. Okay, so which thought are you going to believe, right? I mean, we could go on all day about this. Don't believe everything you think. Okay, so that's our thoughts. But then how about your emotions? Well, okay, we pretty much know those are pretty fickle. I don't know how old you are, but when I was your age, I didn't know this about my emotions. They're kind of fickle. They can't be fully trusted, because they're one thing 1 minute and another thing another minute, and pretty soon after you live with that long enough, you start thinking, wow, these are pretty fickle. Maybe I shouldn't trust these completely. And we even have expressions around that, like hindsight's 20/20, because like we're all angry at somebody, and then we think about the situation later and we have a completely different take on it. Okay, so that's even, we know our emotions are not so exactly how they appear in the moment. But then there's our perception. So that's really, for me, it was kind of a, wow, really? So I always like the example from my own experience of, say I'm in a funky mood, and I come home from work, and I hit the answering machine, and somebody's saying something, and I'm like, even the way I hear their voice is like funky, because I'm funky, right? And then the next day I didn't erase it, so I listened to it again, and like, oh, I don't hear that in there today. I don't even hear it in their voice. Like the tone I heard, that was really a revelation to me. So, okay, this is where we're starting today. We're reading this book called Don't Believe Everything You Think. And this has something to do with wisdom. And so that's the topic of the day. And what Venerable Chuni presented this morning so far is quite helpful, because we consider these kind of dependent arising that she talked about, things made from causes and conditions, and things are made of parts, and that things are depend on being labeled and conceived. That's actually kind of like if you could understand that fully, you would be a Buddha. Actually, you would be a Buddha, because, well, you could do it earlier than that. Actually, you'd have to have the full understanding of emptiness to understand that fully. Emptiness is the word that in our, the jargon we use, the words we use, it's when we try to understand what is reality, we say it's empty. It's empty of something, and that's what we're going to try to talk about today. So let's start with something that a friend of ours who teaches college students said, because he's had to figure out how to say these things better than I. Okay, he said, when the Buddha awoke from the dream that we still dream, of the veil of how things appear, ordinary appearances, when he awoke, he saw the ultimate reality of things just as they are. And so even the word Buddha means one who has awakened. And so the Buddha isn't seeing the things in the same way that we are. And he was very, so this illusoriness of ordinary appearances is implied even by the title of the Buddha's name. He is awake from that. And he was very motivated for us to be happy and cared for beings and wanted to benefit them. So he was motivated to help us. And he worked, when he taught within the world of how things appear to us, which was what we call conventional reality, really, how things appear to us. He taught within that, because how else are you going to teach somebody? You gotta kind of get in the same paradigm with somebody to teach them. You gotta enter their world. When I tried to adopt my 12-year-old nephew, I really tried to enter his world and understand how he saw things and how he thought. And that's how the Buddha had to deal with us. Same way. And so he used language to point us in the right direction. And so there's this sense in what we're talking about here of appearances and reality, some kind of doubleness to the world. And as Guy calls it, there's these shifting appearances and conventions, like manners. In one country, when you slurp your soup and make all this noise, it's very polite. And in our country, it's not so polite. In one country, in Tibet, when you stick out your tongue at somebody, it's actually it's a positive thing. In our country, it's not really seen in a positive light. And so, even on that mundane level, there's all these shifting appearances, because the world is very vast and diverse. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the conventional reality. All of these things that are dependent arisings, one thing depending on another, and another, and another. All the diversity of what we see is conventional reality. But then underneath it, there's this kind of, you might almost even say, a mystery of things just as they are. That's how Guy said this. The sheer reality. But where do we find the sheer reality? We can't find this reality anywhere else but right here in the midst of these shifting appearances. And this in our system of philosophy we call the two truths. That there's the conventional reality of all the things that are dependent arisings, and then there's their ultimate mode of existing, how they really exist. And that's the words we would use is they're empty of inherent existence. Because when you hear the word empty, you always have to say to yourself, empty of what? Is it empty of blue? Empty of metal? Empty of what? And what we're saying is it's empty of inherent existence. So that's what we're going to try to explain. So that gives a little idea of what wisdom is going to try to, you take lifetimes figuring this out, but we're going to address, just try to address what they're talking about in these verses in this next bit. So he starts off with, this is the practice of bodhisattvas, is how that verse ends. So who are bodhisattvas? How many people know? Okay, so not even half the room. So a bodhisattva, that's the name of someone who has what we call bodhicitta, actually. And it's this, the awakening mind. It's this, actually you have two intentions to be a bodhisattva. You've got these intentions so strong, they're spontaneous, and they're just dominating your life. You have the intention to relieve the suffering of every being, to be a benefit to every being. That's one intention, and that's the major thing. And the other is, hey, I'm going to become a Buddha to do it. Why? Because the Buddha has perfected all their good qualities, and they've gotten rid of all their unwholesome qualities. And they actually have an omniscient mind, so they don't have to figure out what's the best thing to say to this person in this situation. I mean, we can't even do that. Our communication is so hard for us. And if we could know what somebody was thinking, like when I tried to enter in the world of my nephew, I was trying to get inside of his mind, how does he tick? What's up for him, and how can I understand him, and how can I benefit him? Well, the Buddha actually has this omniscient mind. He knows all the things that can be known. So that's pretty amazing. That's what we want. That you can be of the greatest benefit then. So that's the idea here of what we're trying to do. So the person who wants to do that so strongly that it's spontaneous, that's a bodhisattva. So this verse, since the five perfections without wisdom cannot bring perfect enlightenment, that first part. So enlightenment is awakened. That's what a Buddha is. We use that word. They're enlightened. They've traveled the path. They've done it. So then, okay, maybe we decide we want to do that. But then how are you going to go about it? Once you have an aspiration, say I want to go to New York for some reason. Okay, you have the aspiration, but then how are you going to get there? You got to have a method. You have to have a plan, and you have to do it, right? So how do you become a Buddha? Well, this is this first verse. The five perfections without wisdom cannot bring perfect enlightenment. So there's actually what we call the six perfections, or the six far-reaching practices. That's what that verse is talking about. And this is how you become a Buddha. You actually, these six things encapsulate the entire path to Buddhahood. And that's just amazing to me. So that's the first. Then you have to learn how to gather disciples, how to be a good role model and walk the walk and all the things that entails. And then you have to practice, in our tradition believes you have to practice Tantra. So that's how we describe it. But all of it is really encapsulated in these six far-reaching practices. So what are those? Well, we'll list them. Some people in this room will know this, but these things won't be unfamiliar to people. We all have some of this already. We just haven't perfected them. We have some generosity. We have some ethical conduct. We have some fortitude or patience. We have some joyous effort. Sometimes we don't. Lots of times we do. We have some concentration, and we have some wisdom. And when you do those to their full ability, that's what we're talking about here. We call them, but you can do them just in a mundane way, in a worldly way. So what makes them far-reaching? They're not just called the six perfections or the six practices. They're called the six far-reaching practices. And what is far-reaching about them? It's because you have this intention. This is the power of this intention. You want to benefit all beings, and you want to become a Buddha to do it. You have the bodhicitta mind. So when you have that mind, that's when we call them far-reaching. We have a lot of terminology to kind of cover here to explain these verses. And then we also have this expression that they're purified and realized when you hold them with wisdom. So it's not like I'm just kind of generous because I gave somebody, I was driving down the road and some guy was out there with a sign and I handed him $2. I'm generous, right? Well, I might not even be generous. Generosity, all of these 6 practices are mental states. It's how the mind is doing it. It's not the action itself, it's the mind. That's how these are described. So a mind that's generous is one that's taking delight in giving, right? That's how we define it. So it's not the giving the $2. It's the mind that takes delight in giving. And this is one of the practices that we want to have. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I just want to give the idea that we have to have this far-reaching, we have to have this bodhicitta on board, and we have to have this wisdom on board. And what kind of wisdom? It's the wisdom that realizes the emptiness of the agent, the object, and the action. Now, why do I bring this up? Those funny words? Because this verse brings them up. I'm stuck. I have to explain the 3 spheres. And this 3 spheres refers to agent, object, and action. And that's the last half of the verse, so we're going to get that to the last half of the talk. Because we have to set kind of more understanding. So we have this kind of wisdom. So basically what I'm trying to say is that these 6 far-reaching practices encompass the whole path. And this is important to have. It's important we have to have a path that's unmistaken and complete. If you want to do something, you have to have, if you're going to even knit a sweater or build a house, you can't just build the roof and forget the rest, or not have any knitting needles. You have to have everything. You have to have all the causes and conditions together to put something together, including awakening to Buddhahood. You have to have it has to be both complete and it has to be unmistaken, meaning that you've got the right causes in place. Because if you don't have the right causes, you're not going to get the right result. We all are raised in a school system here that teaches us a lot about causality, so this is easy for us to understand. If you want applesauce, you don't buy oranges. If you want to grow carrots, you don't plant pumpkin seeds, right? We got that one down. So we're not. We have this understanding of causality. So if you want to become a Buddha, you have to get the right causes and conditions together, complete and unmistaken. And what's amazing about this is that what underlies all of that is compassion. Compassion is what underlies every single one of those 6 things. And when you think about this bodhicitta mind, it's like that's what compassion is. Our definition of compassion is relieving the suffering and the causes of suffering. That's the Buddhist definition of compassion. So that's what a Buddha or a bodhisattva is trying to do. And so when they're engaging in those 6 practices, that's how you, that's always there. So what are the full causes and conditions that the Buddha taught in order to help sentient beings to become awakened? When we talk about compassion there, we usually talk about great compassion, not just like, I don't want this person to suffer or that person to suffer. It's like, I don't want anyone to suffer and I'm going to do something about it. You have this great compassion. You have a sense of resolve. You've kind of dedicated yourself. It's very strong. And that's the cause to help us to develop this bodhicitta mind, which is the main cause of becoming a Buddha. Okay, so the causes are great compassion that leads to this bodhicitta mind, and then the perfect method, the whole complete set of causes. So, one way we talk about this, because we always have a lot of ways to express these things, is a little bit of shorthand. We condense those 6 into 2. We call it method and wisdom. And the reason I want to talk about this is because we have to see how these support each other. It's very important as a practitioner to understand this, because especially Westerners, we don't go much for the merit side of things. We go more for, a lot of us don't have a lot of experience in thinking this way or seeing things this way until we practice for a while. So here's how it goes. These two, we have what we call the collection of merit and the collection of wisdom. The collection of merit is like the method side of the path, and the collection of wisdom is like the wisdom side of the path. So those 6 things, they break up, and they take the first 3, and those are pretty much the method, and the last 2, this concentration and wisdom, that's like the wisdom side. And the joyous effort, you need that for all of them. You need to have this joyous energy, this this delight in creating virtue is how we call it. You have to have that to do all of them. So when you have this, when you have the collection of merit, that actually enhances your wisdom. And that's quite important as a practitioner to understand. When we do meritorious, virtuous, wholesome things with this kind of intention, especially with this far-reaching intention, we create a lot of merit or positive potential. And this is like, you could think of it like you want to have a nice garden. I always think of carrots because I learned to garden just by trial and error. I didn't read books. I just started planting things and saw what happened. And so when I planted carrots, they would grow like 2 roots. They would split all the time into 2. And it's because I hadn't prepared the soil well enough. It was too coarse. So you can think of merit as like you've got this garden out there and it's all crappy and you need to clear out all the stuff and you need to enhance the soil and get it like so that when you put the seed in, something will happen. So you could think of the seed as like the wisdom, but when you're going to grow carrots, unless you have good soil and sunlight and all these other conditions, it's not going to happen. So that's what this merit is like. It purifies and enriches our mind, not our soil, but our mind. And so it makes us more receptive. Then we can understand emptiness better, because it's not that easy to understand. And so in that sense, the method side of the path enhances the wisdom side of the path. And it makes our wisdom be able to be more deep. And you have this experience, but you might not have thought about it this way. Like when you read something, anyone who's read Dharma books can say, wow, I feel like I never read that book before. And they read it like a year ago, but it's like, wow, it's just all so new, and it hits your mind in a completely different way, and you're more receptive, and you understand things you didn't understand before. And before I learned about, this idea of, making the mind more receptive, merit, by creating virtue and all this, I would have just said, well, it's because I read it again. It's because time passed. I don't think that you could just attribute it to time passing, but I hadn't really thought about it. So I didn't really buy into this idea of merit. It kind of seemed like a bank account to me, like I'm just going to put things in this bank and it's going to accumulate, because they talk about it that way, accumulate merit or collection of merit. And I just thought, a bank account doesn't really work for me for developing wisdom. But when I think about it, my own experience, then I actually see, wow, there's some truth to this. But that's something you kind of have to, take on as provisional maybe and see in your own experience. Okay. So we've been learning a little bit about the 6 perfections. And let's see. I'm skipping a lot of things because I threw out the script a little bit here. So now I have to recreate a script and decide. Okay, we'll come back to that, but maybe not. Okay, so that gives us a little idea, because we're trying to understand all this, this basic root verse here. We understand a little bit about what the 6 perfections are. But what is the wisdom part of it? We need to understand that a little bit more than what we've brought up. I've tried to introduce it. It's been introduced a little bit. But one way to think of it, one way it's actually described is that, well, you understand things about the conventional reality and the ultimate reality. And you know what to practice and what to abandon. Kind of like you're growing your garden. You know what to put in the soil, what not to put in the soil, what to take out of the soil. And a lot of our Dharma practice is like that. What do we want to do and what do we not want to do? What do we want to cultivate and what do we want to kind of diminish in ourselves? So that's one way to talk about wisdom. But another way that helps us a little bit more for our topic here is to express this a little differently. It's the same thing, but it's just said differently. So one is there's this wisdom that understands emptiness. And then there's the wisdom of what we could call it maybe conventional reality, but in the scriptures they actually talk about certain fields of knowledge in the traditional sense. Scriptures they'll say like logic, grammar, poetry, different topics, and what it boils down to is you need to have some skills in the world to help people. Like if you only had wisdom but you didn't know how to speak, it might be hard to teach. We have to have other skills to be able to benefit people. And so it's understood that you need to have some idea what's going on in the world and how it works and, really how to kind of put the pedal to the metal would be be in the trenches a little bit, not just theoretically I have all the, the wisdom. You have to have some skills. So that's why they emphasize these topics of knowledge, but it's mainly it's developing the skills to benefit beings. And then the other one is knowing how to benefit beings. And of these, what we're going to talk about today is mostly this first one, the wisdom realizing emptiness. And why is that so important? What's the big picture here? The big picture is that this is the wisdom that frees us from all of our suffering. The Buddhist worldview is that our suffering is created by causes, and it's unnecessary. And we can do something and change that. And their view is even bigger because they believe, multiple lifetimes, that not only has this life got some dissatisfactory elements to it, but we're going to be reborn again and again and again in the same situation of things not being satisfactory. Different kinds of maybe mental or physical pain, all the hardships that come up in life, but also even things that we think are so fantastic in a worldly way, unfortunately, are not so fantastic because they're all temporary, they're all transient. And we actually are so mistaken about this, it's just crazy. We were talking about this the other day, I'll give it another shot. We think that the source of our happiness is the things outside of us. And our five senses just lead us to think that way. So when we're going to have this lunch, if we had some chocolate chip mint ice cream, I would say, wow, that's a cause of happiness. And I would get like, yeah, let's have some. Wouldn't you? But think about it. If there was happiness in that ice cream, you should be able to eat it and continue and eat and eat and eat and eat, and you should get happier and happier and happier. And we're all laughing because that's not the way it works. The happiness isn't in the ice cream, and our sense of that pleasure is in these external objects is way off base. It's a delusion, to use the Buddhist word. And worse than that, even the things that are pleasurable don't last. They're transient, and that bums us out. It's a bummer, So that's the second one. And then the third one is, of the three ways that we might describe this, what's unsatisfactory in this constant being born, dying, life after life, until you do something about it, is that, and this is a uniquely Buddhist idea because most religions actually have those first two ideas in some way, shape, or form. But this last one is uniquely Buddhist. It's saying that really just having a body and a mind is not so satisfactory because why? Because when we're in this ordinary samsaric world, this existence, we're under the control of afflictions and karma. Meaning, afflictions are all these disturbing emotions that come up in our mind, like just at the drop of a hat, like you're in a great mood, everything's going fine, the smallest little thing happens, and if you're a meditator, you really get to watch this, and you watch your mind just go crash, you know, it's a drag, you know, and that just happens like that. Our lives, any slight change of condition in our lives, and things can change like that. And it's so true, but we don't see that. Like, you know, if you just like, one car accident will really change your life, right? One change of conditions, that will really change your life. You know, and that's what we're talking about here. Just the slightest thing, just some little virus, some little piece of metal in the wrong place, some little this, that it will change dramatically and quickly. And that is, according to the Buddha, what the Buddha saw is that that's our basic situation, is that we're under the control of these afflictions coming up, and our previous actions ripening into the karma. And so that's not satisfactory. So we need to, and the way to liberate yourself from that is this wisdom, realizing the emptiness of inherent existence. That's a mouthful. So we want to try to at least get, you know, we're not going to understand this today, but we're going to just try to talk about it a little bit so that we can get to the last verses and make sure we understand those before we walk out the door. But maybe there's a better reason, is that we want all to be happy and none of us want to suffer, and there's a way to go about that. So, okay, what is inherent existence that doesn't really exist, but we all think it does? It's kind of basically the way we see everything. One way you could say it is like this. We're basically all colorblind and we don't know it. We're all seeing things wrong and we don't know it. We're mistaken in how we're seeing things all the time, and we're not aware of it. And how is it that we're seeing things? We're seeing things as inherently existent. And what the heck does that mean? It means that when things appear to us, they just seem kind of independent. They're there from their own side. You know, the way I make this vivid is through the affliction of anger. When I'm angry at somebody, you know, they really are a jerk. From their own side, they're a jerk through and through. They don't have to really do anything. They're just a jerk. And I'm kind of, then I turn it really quickly and I start hating myself. I'm like, and I'm such a lousy person to be thinking this. Really, truly. That's just the way I am. You know, Kevin, who used to live here, he said that once. That's just the way I am. This is kind of, I'm trying to give really mundane things that we might understand, you know. 'Cause I don't have realizations of this, so I have to just teach it in the way I can. Sorry. But, you know, that's not really accurate. This is just the way I am. They're really, truly a jerk. No, it's like this. If you were on a bus, this is a great example for this. If you were on a bus and this guy got on with and his kids were like really just being really misbehaving, and you'd think, God, what a terrible father. He's doing nothing. He's just sitting there. And you might have that thought, and it might be really strong, and you would think, he's a terrible father. From his own side, just independently of any other factors, your mind just does that. It just like gloms onto it because we haven't really thought this through. But then you find out he's coming from his wife's funeral. And just that, when you know anything about all what she was speaking of, all the causes and conditions that make anything arise, then you can't see it as so like existing from its own side, unrelated to any other factors. Because that's what it means. The person who would describe this the best, Chantakirti, he said, he was talking about self and selflessness, because we have these funny words to describe this. We say that there's a person who we might call a self, and that person is selfless. And we don't know that. We have to realize that they're selfless. And then we get all mixed up with the words because they keep using this word self, but they use it in two different ways. So one kind of self is a person, me, you, selves, people, persons. Another kind of way they use self in Buddhism is when they talk about selflessness. Things are non-self. They're not self. They're selfless. There's selflessness. So we're trying to figure out what is the selflessness of the person, what is the selflessness of this and that. And we're not trying to say, we're not using self in the same way there. What we're saying is this. Here, self is an inherent nature of phenomena. That is a non-dependence on another. Like it doesn't depend on any other factors. It exists in and of itself, on its own, unrelated to anything else, independent. Well, really, how could that be? How can anything be completely independent, not on any other factors? That's why we study dependent arising, because once you really understand it, you see this kind of inherent existence is like total independence, not dependent on any other factors. It just is that way. He really is a jerk. Just is. Or this really is a cup from its own side. Didn't take me to conceive of it, didn't take anything to produce it, didn't take anything else, doesn't have to have any parts. It just is. We see things that way. So this is hard to understand. It might you be able to understand the words here a little bit, I hope. But it's hard to see in your own mind. And this is why we learn about these things, and then we discuss them and contemplate them to understand the meaning, and then we meditate. And then what happens is you start to see these things in your own experience. So I want to explain one thing about this because I think this is a great example. I'm trying to teach to everyone in the room. So I think this might work. We'll see. So we talk about that things depend on other factors. They can't exist in and of themselves, right? That's what I've just said. So Reba Rinpoche said there's not a single phenomena that exists from its own side, on its own power, because everything exists by merely being labeled by the mind. That was that third kind of dependent arising she talked about this morning. So we had the three kinds of dependent arising. The first one, things dependent on causes and conditions. Things depend on parts. You have to have all these parts. And then we conceive and label things. And you might think, oh, it's like the label on a soup can. No, that's not what we're talking about here. It's not that gross kind of labeling. This is a very subtle thing. But here, let's make an example of it that's a more gross example that we can understand and see how you might say, I have conceived and labeled this as a cup. And that is why it exists as a cup, because I conceived and labeled it. Don't you think that's kind of strange? Couldn't I call it just anything then, and it would be anything? Wouldn't anything just be anything then? It seems like that to me. Okay, so how is it that things depend on conception and labeling? Okay, here's an example. In Tibetan monasteries, they have people who lead the chants. We'll just call it a chant leader. They have actually a name, it's Omze. But a chant leader. So not everyone is a chant leader. So to be a chant leader, first you need to be proficient with the recitation and the rituals, right? Your voice has to have a particular tone and ability. You have to be fitting to be the leader of the chant with that kind of voice. You have to know the prayers by heart. You have to be perfectly knowledgeable in all the different chants. You have to know them by memory. You have to have what we call a perfect basis. You have to have all the attributes. You have to be a perfect basis to be the chant leader. But even when you have all that, you're not yet the chant leader. Just like you're not yet the president of the United States, the president of a company, anything. Although just fitting that basis doesn't make you the chant leader. To become a chant leader, you need the abbot of the monastery who comes by and say, okay, you have these qualities, and from now on, you're the chant leader. Now, you're the chant leader. Now his existence is now a chant leader. Previously, he had the basis to be a chant leader, but he wasn't yet the chant leader. He was a perfect basis of a chant leader, the perfect basis of imputation, the perfect basis of designation. But you aren't that until the abbot comes by and says, you're the chant leader. So think about this. You even have the qualities in the basis to be a chant leader, but you're not that until you're correctly labeled chant leader. It's as simple as that. One way you can think of it, I don't know. I tie these together because I think they're the same thing. The way the mind is functioning is the way I want to talk about this now. If you were in this room and someone said there's a snake in here, wouldn't you be a little uncomfortable? And you'd want to know if it was in here or not. So you would want to make sure you searched the whole room to see the snake wasn't there, right? Okay, so let's go to... And so when we do our meditations on this, that self that we're talking about, that doesn't exist the way we think, or anything that doesn't exist the way we think, we have to prove it to ourselves. So we have to actually, like this example of the snake in the room is a good idea, because if we're going to prove something to ourselves, we have to look in every part of this room. We can't just examine this half of the room and say there's no snake here, so there's not a snake in the room, because we're still going to be kind of fearful that there's a snake here. Same thing, this sense of self that we have, or that exaggerated sense of self that doesn't exist, that we reify, that we think exists on its own, is inherently existent. If we want to get rid of that, we have to look everywhere for it. We have to know that we've looked everywhere for it, within the body and the mind completely, and outside of the body and mind completely. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we do when we want to prove this to ourselves. But how is our mind working then? So let's take another snake example. Okay, say it's kind of dark and you walk outside and there's a rope out there and you think it's a snake. Right away, you get fearful and you have all this, you have a reaction, because you're say it's a cobra or something, rattlesnake, and you're really close and it could bite you. They have one called a 7-step snake we learned about recently. Why? Because in 7 steps you're dead after it bites you. So say it's a 7-step snake. It's true. It's the name of a snake in, I don't know where that was, Indonesia or someplace. Somebody told us about this. Because they use this example so much, we have to learn about snakes. So, okay, let's say it was a 7-step snake. You thought it was that. And you would, of course, get fearful, or you would have some kind of reaction, some sort of ordinary being. But then say somebody put a little more light on it, and then you say, oh, it's just a snake. It's just a rope, right? This process of the mind that thought it was a snake, that process, conceiving and labeling it, or how you got to that notion, is the same way you conceive. The same thing is happening in your mind when you see that rope is inherently existent. The mind is doing the same thing. And we could probably spend some years trying to see this in our meditation practice, but at least we can understand this intellectually. Like, this is what the Buddha taught. It's helpful to know these things. Okay, so did we get through the first half of the verse? I think we kind of did. Let's go back and look at it and make sure. And then, because once you understand the first half, it's not too hard to understand the second half. Oh, except for there was a good example in here. It was the story. That sense of self that we get sometimes, that real live jerk, that really terrible father, that really whatever, that's not existent. That doesn't exist at all. That's the object to be negated. So that's a word to learn. Okay, so the story for this, every one of these chapters has the root verse, an explanation, and then a real life story. Venerable Chodron wrote this book based on these verses written decades or centuries ago. And she got stories for each one from people that she knew. A lot of them are in the room. This one actually, I think, is her story. I think this was her. She called it Marilyn. Marilyn. This is her story, though, I'm almost positive. Called Missing the Object of Negation. Many years ago, we nuns went to a monk's monastery to receive teachings 5 days a week. Our teacher was instructing us on a text that had to do with realizing the ultimate reality. He was a great teacher, too. An important step in that process was identifying the object of negation, the false way the self appears to us. This false way the jerk appears to us, the false way we appear to ourselves when we hate ourselves for thinking that guy's a jerk. These things that we reify. This, he said, was the most difficult part of the meditation. According to our teacher's instructions, a good time to check how the I, or self, appears to us was when we were under the influence of a strong affliction, such as anger. One afternoon, just after our teacher left, at the conclusion of the teaching, a monk who was a good friend of mine stood up and announced, "From now on, all the nuns should leave the monastery within 15 minutes at the end of the teaching." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How dare the monks be so prejudiced against the nuns that they would essentially kick us out each day, calling a halt to what had previously been good-natured and friendly talk at the end of the teachings. Furious, I told my friend, or the person I thought had been my friend, I needed to speak to him now. As we walked down the road, I told him how hurt and angry I was. Reacting to my harsh speech, he got stirred up too. However, we both kept listening and sharing, and after a while we calmed down again and felt like friends again. At that moment he turned to me and said, "Looks like we just missed the opportunity to observe the object of negation." I hope that makes sense to some people here. Okay, the ones who laughed kind of got it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I think we kind of explained the first half. Since the 5 perfections without wisdom cannot bring perfect enlightenment, along with skillful means cultivate the wisdom which does not conceive the 3 spheres as real. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. Real. What's real? That gets, that's a little hard. That's why we talk about what's real. And actually, in our language, we don't really use the word. In the lower schools in Buddhism, they do, and it really threw me off. I had to ask Bhikkhu Bodhi about that when he was here, because the stuff I'm teaching at the prison, things were real, and I'm like, how real is that? So, yeah, for us, what's real? All things are dependently arisen. That's as real as it gets. They're empty of inherent existence. They're they're merely designated. Wow. Okay, so the 3 spheres. So basically, when we're doing these 6 practices, these 6 far-reaching practices, we want to kind of, one way we say this is we want to seal the practice with this contemplation on emptiness. And so the way we say that is we say, contemplate the 3 spheres, or what's the other way we say that? The three spheres, or there's another way we say that. I forgot what it is right now. Anyway, the idea is that we try to see the emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of the agent, the object, and the action. We had to get back to that, right? The 3 spheres, the circle of 3, that's the other way. What are they? They are the agent, the object, and the action. So we know that those 3 things don't exist independently, because we already proved to ourselves somewhat, at least a little bit, that things all exist dependently. So they can't be independent. They all exist in relationship to each other. For instance, if you were going to talk about generosity, let's say you did a generous act and then you wanted to seal it with emptiness, you would say to yourself, well, there's not really a giver without somebody to give something to. The subject would be the giver. The person you give something to could be, one way you could say is the object, or it could be the thing you give, And then there's the action of giving, right? You can't have a giver without somebody giving. You can't have a receiver or someone who's given something to without somebody who gives. They all depend on each other. So everything we do, we try to seal it with that kind of understanding. Things don't exist from their own side. They exist by merely being labeled independence on each other. I think that, maybe I didn't, I guess I didn't put that in there. So, does that make any sense? I mean, it's not that hard of an idea. It's hard to really understand it, but I mean, the 3 spheres is kind of an easy idea. Everything that you do, whenever we do any kind of virtuous action, we want to seal the practice by thinking of emptiness. And why do we want to do that? Because we want to. Emptiness is the total opposite. The wisdom that realizes emptiness is the total opposite of how we're seeing things all the time. So we really have to habituate ourselves. This is how I think of it. We really have to habituate ourselves to see things differently. So we try to build that into the practice from the get-go by sealing it, sealing the practice. Like when we do our practices every morning and evening, we do the 35 Buddha practice. What do we do at the end? We seal it with the contemplation of emptiness. Why? Because the whole time it feels so real. I'm really, like this thing we're trying to this quality, we did some unwholesome action, and we think it's kind of like exists from its own side. It's going to kind of bug me for the rest of my life, and if you're a Buddhist, it's going to bug me for all of my future lives. We hold this stuff as just existing on its own, and we think things are permanent. We're so messed up around all this. So if we seal this with emptiness, it kind of loosens the screws in our mind, and we have to think, oh, well, maybe there were like if you think about dependent arising, it will dissipate this confusion. Think about all the different factors. Let's think about something current. The problems in Syria. One episode of what you look at on the news one day, just one episode, one event of countless events at this point. Think of one episode of one thing you've seen there and try to think of all the causes and conditions that went into that happening. It would be really hard to have the same reaction. Like I'm having some reactions to the world news myself, and I have to work on it in meditation to avoid my own racism, basically, I would say, my own stereotypes that are arising in my mind because of fears or whatever. So this is what I do. I think of like all the different things that go into any of these events that I see. And then it softens my mind. I can't really see any enemies out there anymore. I see a lot of people who are suffering tremendously. And if you want to have peace in a chaotic world, you can't see everybody as enemies. You have to have compassion. And it doesn't mean that you let people walk all over you. It doesn't mean you let them do horrible things. It doesn't justify any of the acts that are unwholesome. But to have a peaceful heart so that you can interact with things in the world with your wisdom, because as Venerable Jigme taught me, physiologically, when you have fear in the mind, I think it was fear we were talking about, or stress. We were talking about stress. When you're really stressed, which fear is quite stressful, you can't really access your wisdom. Your brain kind of starts to shut down even. So when we're in a situation like the world is now, if we want to be wise, even in a worldly sense, we have to keep ourselves peaceful and calm so that we can access our own wisdom and not be, well, we all know what it's like to be angry and reactive and how hard communication is anyway, and we regret things in the past that we've done because we were just under the influence of disturbing emotions and wrong ideas. So this is how we can help to make the world more peaceful, by understanding things in this way, interacting with people in this way, so that other people can be more calm. It starts with one person, and then it goes out to like ripples to everyone that you see. We have to keep a hopeful attitude in the potential of every sentient being. That's how we say it in the Buddhist way. Every sentient being. We can't lose hold of that. Whenever you give up on the potential of someone, it's going to be pretty difficult then. So we have to have this kind of, we seal our practices with this as Buddhists so that we can go against the appearances that are coming to our minds all the time. We have the appearances all the time, but we don't always assent to them, and that's when it's really a problem. This thing that we're trying to get rid of, this is actually a misconception. It's we assent to the appearance, and it's maybe I'll close by trying to explain that in my own words. When somebody says something to a friend or to somebody and they start criticizing them, we might not really enjoy hearing that so much, but it doesn't really get our sense of self very strong. We might, we can usually stay pretty cool and calm. But if somebody starts attacking us, we get the sense of self really arises. And it's because we already have maybe the appearance that we're inherently existent, but we assent to the appearance. We buy into it in a way that the self feels so strong at that moment that we're in trouble. And you can see that in your own experience. When they criticize somebody else, you say, hey, don't get upset. They're just having a bad day. When they criticize you, a little harder to get to that place. And that's that sense of self. We're assenting to that appearance. This is what we try to understand in our meditations. So we train ourselves in these 6 far-reaching practices, and we try to keep the method and the wisdom side all kind of happening at once, so that we can eventually become Buddhas and be in the best situation to help every being that we meet. Wouldn't that be wonderful?